Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, President of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the libertarian perspective, sponsored by the Future of Freedom Foundation, whose mission is to present an uncompromising case for libertarianism. You can find all our work at fff.org. I'm joined, as I am every week, by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
Great to see you and to have our viewers and listeners join us for a little while today.
Yeah, likewise. As you know, we've had the big disaster of Hurricane Harvey in Houston and Beaumont and surrounding areas. And so I thought this is a nice opportunity to talk about libertarian principles, since they seem to get lost whenever there's a crisis. And of course, with hurricanes come crises. And there are two major elements here. On the front page of the New York Times today, they are chiding Texans for taking federal aid, while at the same time always declaiming about how bad federal aid is and condemning it and so forth, sort of implying that Texans are acting hypocritically now that they need the money. And then the other angle of this is the price gouging aspect, where people were being prosecuted or threatened with prosecution for overcharging for products. And there was this picture on the internet that somebody had walked in, I think, to a Walmart and taken a picture of bottled water that was selling it for, like, I don't know, a multiple of the pre-hurricane price. And so when word got out, the store immediately apologized and lowered prices back to the pre-hurricane standard. And the Attorney General's office received thousands of complaints, or hundreds of complaints, of price gougers, and they said that they were threatening them with prosecutions or fines for doing these types of things. So this is standard fare when it comes to hurricanes. So why don't we deal with the price gouging element first, Richard? And why don't you go ahead and go first with your economic insight into price gouging and hurricanes?
Well, if I can sort of lead into that by saying, recently here in Charleston, South Carolina, we had an instance of price gouging. I know it's a shocking thought, even here in South Carolina, but it was during the eclipse. Now, viewers and listeners may know that because of the rotation of the Earth, this recent full eclipse traversed from this Oregon or Washington State all the way across the U.S. And literally the best viewing of the total eclipse before leaving the United States was right here in the Charleston area. My wife and I stood in our backyard and with the special glasses enjoyed it. But obviously there was a large arrival of people into the greater Charleston area from other parts of the United States as well as around the world to go ooh and ah to be able to see this full eclipse. And there were people who owned houses or apartments here in the Charleston area who for a couple of 3 days moved in with friends or relatives to rent out their house and apartment, and as much as $2,000 a day because of the shortages of hotel rooms for the influx of eclipse visitors and tourists.
I didn't know there was such a concentration of greedy, self-centered people in Charleston.
I mean, I'm flabbergasted. I'm flabbergasted. And I understand that you see, I was shocked by this because the media had pointed out, even Fox News, that this had occurred. This was occurring in Oregon. And I said, well, here, not in South Carolina. But then I was talking to some people after that, and they said, yes, we heard that people here in Charleston even did that too, Jacob. I mean, horrible.
Just shocking, Richard, just shocking.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, but while that sounds comical or sarcastic and everything, there is a serious side to this, particularly during times of local emergencies, such as an earthquake, a hurricane, tornadoes and whatnot, particularly of a hurricane of the devastation that hit the Corpus Christi, Houston, and then into Louisiana size. Because as I'm just repeating what I assume most viewers and listeners know from the media, it not only was a great force, but it peculiarly was moving so slow over the land that it was like raining terribly with everything destroyed, and lasting a lot longer in terms of duration of days than normally one of these things tend to stay in one area as it's moving. The consequences is that the area became not only terribly destroyed. I mean, all of us have seen those horrific pictures on television, on the news, and so on. But the available supplies of essential goods and items for just everyday life. Now the fact is that the government can impose a price control, which is basically anti-gouging, and they can set it at a level equal to, let's say, the price before the emergency occurred. But what will be the consequences of this? There's two negative effects if the government does that. First of all, there are a lot more people demanding these essential items: flashlights, batteries, bottled water, canned food that you can eat that do not have to be heated up if you lose electricity and so on, and you don't have a gas stove that's working. Little elementary sort of first aid, medical supplies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's a huge increase in demand for these because people are concerned if they can get by during the crisis without serious hardships or life-threatening problems for their families. So there's a rapidly increased demand. But the fact is that if you cap the price, the only supply that's going to be there is the supply that was there before the crisis was announced and people became panicky about. And that means there's going to be a greater demand for all of these items than there's an availability on the market. Now, that means that there's a lot of people who are going to get nothing, or the government is going to have to ration it by some principle of their own that will involve politics and expediency, having nothing to do with your own sense of the immediacy and necessity and intensity you need for it. The result is you create shortages, imbalances, hardships, and lacks of essential things. Now, if the price is allowed to rise, that is, this much greater demand with the realization of a smaller and shorter supply, you immediately create an incentive for the market outside of the crisis area to find ways of as soon as possible, transporting additional supplies into the affected area, precisely because of the non-normal price, that is, non-emergency price, rising so rapidly. There are quick, short-run profits to be made. Let's get the supplies in to meet this intense demand, for which a higher price is now rationing the market for us to serve a need, but in our self-interest to satisfy it. And immediately as the supplies start coming in, the increased supply relative to the greater emergency demand will start bringing downward pressure on the price. Now, a lot of people say, but it's an emergency, it's a hurricane. How can these supplies be gotten in? The fact is, in many national emergencies or natural emergencies like this, such as a Katrina in Louisiana or now with Houston, if the price is allowed to rise, people find methods and avenues to skirt around the hazardous areas to bring it in as immediately as possible. Even if the supply cannot arrive the most dramatic day of the weather crisis, it's just impossible to move. You want the supplies to be there as readily and as quickly as possible the day after at least the storm starts diminishing enough for modes of transportation, however hazardously, to start to be available. Otherwise, we're just extending the pain and the unavailability of this. The fact is the market works. And in fact, you want it to work and has the capacity to work with adaptability, flexibility, and profit-oriented incentives, most especially during these crisis times.
Yeah, you're emphasizing the importance of the price system to a market economy. I mean, the price system is simply a vehicle of communications. It tells people something, and they don't have to know why a price is rising. They simply have to see the price rise and act accordingly. And what people forget that is that in this emergency, there is a set quantity of goods at that particular time within the crisis environment. Let's say that there's 1,000 bottles of water that are available for sale within the crisis environment. Somehow or another, that's going to be allocated. That if prices stay the same as they were, which is required under these price gouging laws, then people just come in and buy as normal, and they're going to sell out. Those 1,000 bottles are going to be gone. But then where's the incentive to bring new bottles in? And you see, when the entrepreneur lacks the incentive to bring in new bottles, that's when people say, oh, the government has to do this. And without the government bringing in water, people would be, dying of thirst. Well, as you point out, the price system is the perfect vehicle for handling a crisis like this. That immediately when the crisis hits, people perceive, the market perceives a scarcity of bottled water. There's only 1,000 total bottles to be distributed. So how's that going to be allocated? Immediately, price soars. Demand's going up, supply is limited. We all learned this in Economics 101. And as the price is soaring, there's also a message that's being delivered to the consumer. The message is, this is very expensive stuff. Treat it carefully. Conserve it. Don't waste it. Don't be washing your hands every 10 minutes. This is expensive stuff. It's like gold water. Watch it carefully. And so that causes people to conserve. At the same time, you've got entrepreneurs in the other part of the United States that are sitting there watching this soaring price saying, hey, I got an opportunity to make a quick buck here. Let's assume, just hypothetically speaking, that a bottle of water in Tulsa, Oklahoma costs 50 cents, and suddenly in Texas, in Houston, it's selling for $20 a bottle because of soaring prices. Well, somebody in Tulsa is going to sit there, some teenager or some guy that needs some extra money, and saying, you mean to tell me if I go out and buy and fill up my truck with bottled water at 50 cents, I can go and sell it for $20 a bottle? That's right, sir. Well, suddenly you're going to have all these people saying that's a no-brainer, loading up their trucks, their vans, or trailers with water and bringing them into Houston, which then, of course, starts causing the price to come down to reasonable levels, which is what happens under the laws of supply when supplies are increased. So all we're really talking about here is a price system that is delivering messages to both consumers and suppliers. To consumers, it's saying, time to conserve. Watch your water really carefully. To entrepreneurs, it's saying, time to load up and bring in water and make a quick buck. And when that happens, Richard, there's absolutely no need for government at all. The only reason you need government in there bringing in gasoline or water or flashlights or batteries or whatever is because the market is being distorted and warped. This system of communication is being tampered with, even destroyed, with government anti-gouging laws.
Yeah, let me sort of just add another aspect which you've alluded to. And this is basically the type of Austrian economic argument of markets versus socialism, central planning versus the price system. Friedrich Hayek in particular is famous for his essay, The Use of Knowledge in Society. That besides a division of labor, there's a matching division of knowledge, and a lot of localized knowledge of the particular time and the place that most other people outside of the specialized corner of the society know very little about. If you rely upon the government to do the emergency supplying, then you're depending upon what the emergency government planners can anticipate, coordinate, succeed in devising ways to get the emergency items to where they think it needs to be delivered and distributed. On the other hand, if you rely upon the market, as the Austrians have argued, you allow the decentralized knowledge of everyone in the society to suddenly come into work. The price rises dramatically. It doesn't matter that you, the government agent, or the consumers who now have this hardship in, let's say, the Houston area, know who in Tennessee or Tulsa, Oklahoma, or Spokane, Washington, who might be the supplier of it. It is sufficient that the price rises and people in different corners of the society discover that there's a profit opportunity, and in their own circumstances that others cannot appreciate or perceive in the same way they can now say, is there information or transportation avenues that I know about that I could take advantage of to be able to bring these emergency goods, such as bottled water, to the affected area expeditiously. And why am I interested in expeditiously? Because I'm not the only guy who's going to be trying to supply the water now. Right, instead of 50 cents, it's $20 a bottle. I want to get there first with as much as I can to capture the largest amount of, in this emergency situation, market share and profit opportunity. So you're setting creative minds to work, as is done normally in the market, in a particular focused way to alleviate these scarcities in an emergency situation. But if you limit it to the government, or if you allow only the government to designate certain officially approved non-governmental organizations, then you're narrowing the capacity of multitudes of human minds to be set creatively to work and competitively to alleviate the problems of those in those affected areas.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. The central planning aspect of what Ludwig von Mises called planned chaos. And there's another interesting dimension this in terms of the price system, and that's the labor costs as well. I read an interesting article about how illegal immigrants from Mexico were watching carefully what was happening in Houston because they knew that the price for labor would start going up, and that this would enable or attract them into taking the chance to illegally cross the border. But that's what the price system's all about. It's saying if prices start rising for labor in Houston, what that's saying is, hey, we have a scarcity of labor here. We've got a lot of work that needs to be done. And the way that's communicated is you start seeing a rise in prices for construction workers, bricklayers, or what have you. And there's another disaster of immigration controls. That here would be a perfect opportunity for immigrants to be coming in and filling this demand, this need for low-cost labor, which is very attractive to them because they can see the price that they're going to get paid, which is significantly higher than what they're making in Mexico. They come in, they help Houstonians get back on their feet, help them rebuild their homes, rebuild their offices, and the likelihood is that they then return to Mexico with a boatload of money. Everybody's happy. I mean, that's what the price system does. It coordinates peaceful activity, whether it's with dealing with water or batteries or labor.
Exactly. The market, another instance of this, unfortunately, is what confuses people. Is Frederick Bastiat, the famous 19th century French classical liberal economist, with his instance of what is seen and what is unseen. What is seen is the disaster. What is seen is that government stepping in to solve the problem. What is unseen is that if government wasn't interfering and closing off avenues to insist that it knows best, what is unseen are all the people who would have responded in different ways as consumers, as you pointed out earlier. How can I husband these scarce resources that have become very expensive in this emergency situation for my family and myself, and I'm being told and incentivized to husband it because the price is becoming more and more costly as the crisis gets worse. And that, in fact, makes more available for others rather than one or a handful of people buying it up all at the non-crisis price. And at the same time, what is unseen are all the ways on the supply side who will have the motives, the incentives, and the discovered knowledge to alleviate the crisis in multitudes of alternative ways rather than the single narrow corridor that the government insists upon and imposes as the solution to the emergency problem.
Yeah, as you were bringing up Bastiat, I couldn't help but think about the broken window fallacy here too, that I'm sure has already arisen with respect to the hurricane, where statists argue that, hey, this isn't all so bad. This is going to create jobs for people. This is going to create prosperity, that hurricanes provide opportunities for prosperity. And of course, it's just a variation of Bastiat's broken window fallacy, where the kid breaks the glass of a storefront window, and people argue, oh, well, this isn't all so bad because it creates employment for the glazier industry and creates jobs for that industry, and they'll make money there and spend their money elsewhere. And of course, that's what is seen. But as Bastiat pointed out, as you point out, There's the unseen consequences, that people would have done something else with their money than repair something that would not have been needed repair but for the hurricane. And while we're on the subject of Basquiat and the unseen consequences, that's a nice segue into the other aspect of this thing, or another aspect, and that's the welfarism. And I'd like to take it to a deeper level, or a higher level of sort of what, alluding to what you were suggesting, is that here we have this massive welfare state. We've had it for since the 1930s, where the government takes a huge amount of money from people through their taxes, income taxes, Social Security taxes, and so forth, and then makes this pool of money available to people when they're in need. And then if Texas draws on that pool of money, they say, oh, see, now you're a hypocrite because you condemn the welfare state way of life. But what is unseen in all this, Richard, is that if people had been free to keep everything they earned, if there had been no income tax for the last 25 years, imagine the savings that people would have today with all the money they've paid in taxes. I mean, let's say the average family's paid $25,000. In the last 20 years, that's what, $500,000 in savings they would have in their bank account. And when people are free to keep everything they earn, there's much more to donate. And we've already seen people willing to donate. But when the government's taking a huge amount of people's income, that of course limits the ability of people not only to handle their own needs when they get into trouble because they don't have huge savings because the government has confiscated their savings, but also it limits the ability of people to voluntarily give. And so they point at what is seen. Hey, look, government welfare coming in. Texas hypocrisy. But what is unseen is that they've confiscated massive amounts of savings and capital over the years and continue to do so.
Yes, people would have been in a better position to plan for themselves, and it would have left more money in people's pockets in general in the United States, part of which, no doubt, certainly Americans are the most generous of charity givers. Part of that money that would not have been taxed if it had left in people's pockets would have gone itself to various charitable causes, including those charities that focus on preparation for emergency situations. We think, for example, of the Red Cross or the Salvation Army. They have divisions and parts of their organizations that are always thinking ahead of the potential of an emergency in a particular chapter area nationwide. And the greater the contributions that such organizations receive as precautionary funds and planning to meet these type of crises, the more effective the private sector can be and has been in the past. And if I could just add one other element of what is seen and what is unseen, Jacob, and that is, what the hell are all these people doing, building and rebuilding their houses along the coastal areas, most threatened by these storm surges? A major part of it is what?
The National Flood Insurance.
Insurance. Yeah. A number of our free market fellow colleagues in our freedom movement have been writing about this recently. One piece I read, I go by their facts, is that in a few of these areas, such as occurred like with the Katrina crisis and hurricane a few years ago, or even and I understand a couple of the islands along the Texas coast, there'd be a house that would have like maybe $100,000 value, but it's been washed away, it's been destroyed, it's been washed away, it's been destroyed 3 or 4 times, each time the government covering most of the repair or rebuilding costs, so that the government has shelled out like $500,000 for a house that's worth $100,000 on the market. Now, why not do this? If the government is basically saying you're going to pay nothing or a fraction of what the rebuilding of the house would cost and what it would cost you to have real private sector insurance based upon an insurance company's actuarial of what the premium should be against the risk of this happening in such a hurricane-prone area. So all of these are unintended consequences. People have chosen to live there with a first house, a second house, and bear the destruction of this because the government basically is subsidizing them for part of the risk and cost of doing so. So this is another unintended consequence. There would be less destruction and potential less loss of life and less squandering and misuse of resources if the government wasn't basically creating the moral hazard of incentivizing people to have houses where nature is telling you you should be reluctant to build it.
Yeah, it's another classic example of the perverse consequences of government programs. I mean, this is a federal government program, this flood insurance. And Jim Bovard has just recently written a fantastic article in USA Today.
In fact, I think I was getting Jim's article is the one that I was getting some of the numbers from.
Yeah, and there's another factor about, you mentioned the Red Cross. That the New York Times recently had an article that said that there have been complaints about the Red Cross, that they seem sometimes to be more engaged in promotion than putting money in directly into the impacted areas. And I don't know the extent of what's going on there, but I do know this, that the market has a self-limiting factor involved in it. That is, that if people become dissatisfied with a particular charity, they have an easy remedy, and that's simply don't donate to the charity. I mean, that's what freedom's all about. You have a right to say yes, you have a right to say no. I mean, I'm sure there's people that are approached to, hey, we need some help for this flood or that flood or this crisis, this cancer, whatever. People say no. That's what freedom's about, the right to say no. But if you feel that a charity is not putting your money to the best use, all right, just limit your donations. That sometimes that'll cause the charity to become more efficient. You can't do that with a welfare state, Richard. I mean, try telling people, the government, that you don't like the way Social Security is being administered, and so you're going to stop your, quote, donations. I mean, they will come after you with a wrath that you can't even imagine. They will criminally prosecute you. They will put you in jail. They will fine you. They will seize your assets. They'll go to your place of business, of employment, and harass you and abuse you. There is no voluntary choice when it comes to welfare state taxation. You pay or you end up in jail. That is not the case in the private marketplace. We choose whether to donate to this cause or that cause, and that's really the way it should be across the board. Government has no more business in the charity business than it does in the church business or the monetary business or the business of running an economy.
Maybe you remember, Jacob, it must have been about 15 or 20 years ago, the charity United Way, they had a huge scandal about how the senior administrators were misappropriating the funds. I don't think there was necessarily like in the stealing literal sense, but top-heavy, travel joints, fancy offices, a really misuse of the funds in terms of the stated purpose of it. And that became a national scandal at the time. It must have been 15 or 20 years ago. Maybe some viewer or listener will remember the date better than me. But their donations went through the floor. Because why am I putting my hard-earned money into a charity that had said it was going to do good deeds of X, Y, and Z? And these guys running it are just feather bedding themselves and misusing the money I thought was going to go for good cause A, B, and C. Now, this is the central aspect of this. Now, as maybe some viewers and listeners may know, I had the honor and privilege of serving as the president of the Foundation for Economic Education, FEE, for 5 years. And part of that duty as the president required me to do a lot of traveling around the country on fundraising jaunts to meet existing and potential donors. And I had to explain them what the foundation did, and I had to tell them what I was hoping their generous donation, if they chose to give one, would be used for and would help to advance certain activities of education in defense of the freedom philosophy. And I then had to write a report towards the end of the year with the hope that at end of year giving would be renewed or grown, or they would suggest it to friends to give to fee as well. And I had to show how the money was spent. Not that there was a law that commanded me to do this, or a regulatory agency looking over my shoulder to do it, but in the sense that I had to demonstrate to the donors and supporters of the organization that the money had been well spent, and that it was not being squandered just on salaries or fancy paper clips or anything else, but the good cause that they had given to advance certain economic freedom ideas were being used to the best of our ability in an economizing way, and to justify them giving their generous dollars to us for that purpose, as opposed to a lot of other organizations, political or not, for which they could give part of their hard-earned money. That is the case in the private sector. That is not the case with government, because as you pointed out, with government, you have to pay your taxes. You cannot be remiss on your payment. You could have your money garnished. You can have your property seized. You can end up in jail if you do not agree with what the government wants to spend the money on, even for a worthy cause, or the means by which they're spending the money, which you consider misdirected in solving the problem for which they say they want your money.
Yeah, and another point, of course, is that the left says, oh, well, this is a democracy and majority rules, and so the majority should be able to decide what people should do with their money. And of course, we hold the exact opposite. We hold that there are fundamental rights that are immune from majority rule. We don't use majority rule to force people to go to church or to decide what they're going to read. And by the same token, we should not, in a moral sense, a legitimate sense, use government to force people to do something with their money that they otherwise would not choose to do. Whether people go to church or not is a central part of freedom. And what people do with their own money is just as important a part of freedom as whether to decide to go to church or not. And so that concept of fundamental rights, which is what Jefferson was talking about, would then immunize people from having their money taken from them and given to others, and under the argument that, oh, this means we're all now a caring and compassionate society. On the contrary, it means a society in which there is legalized stealing going on, coercive redistribution of wealth that is the exact opposite of charity and compassion that can only come from the type of society you and I are defending, and that is one based on voluntary choice. But on that note, Richard, we're out of time, and so we'll call it off for the day, and look forward to seeing you next week, Richard.
Until next time, and again, thank you, viewers and listeners, for joining us for this little slice of time.
Yep, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see y'all next week. If you want to see more about what we're doing and writing and talking about, come to fff.org. Richard does a weekly article for us. He did one yesterday. Every Monday we post it on our website and in our FFF Daily, which is free for the asking, and we'll look forward to seeing y'all next week. Thanks again for tuning in.